U.S. President Donald Trump says the war with Iran will end very soon, but with warnings that the U.S. would hit it 20 times harder if oil shipments through the Strait of Hormuz are halted. Iran says that Tehran decides the end of the war, not the U.S. Global markets continue to show sharp swings amid the Middle East tensions, with South Korea's benchmark KOSPI surging more than 5% on Tuesday, while global oil prices also came under control. The South Korean government is making price stabilization its top priority, with plans to introduce a temporary ceiling on petroleum prices later this week. We begin in the Middle East, where the U.S. and Israel continue their operations against Iran. President Donald Trump says the conflict could end soon, but Tehran rejects the idea of renewed talks with Washington, as signs of differences also emerge between the U.S. and Israel. Our Park Kwon-woo starts us off.
Around 10 days after the U.S. and Israel launch operations against Iran, signs of a slight rift are emerging between the two countries. U.S. President Donald Trump said Monday the campaign may be coming to an end soon, contrasting with earlier remarks made with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu that it could last for weeks, if not months.
I think so.
Okay, and with respect
very soon. Look, everything they have is gone, including their leadership.
The shift comes as concerns grow in Washington over rising oil prices, especially after Israeli strikes on the Iranian military's fuel depots over the weekend. Even Senator Lindsey Graham, a hawkish Republican ally of Trump, urged Israel on social media to be cautious about its targets. Trump's message about ending the conflict soon was immediately met with a backlash from Iran. An official from the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps said it was Iran and not the U.S. that would decide when the conflict ends, warning that Tehran wouldn't allow even a single liter of oil to be exported from the region if attacks continue. Iran also signaled that further negotiations with the U.S. are no longer on the table.
Team in the negotiation, said itself that we made a big progress. Still, they decided to attack us. So I don't think, talking with Americans anymore would be, on our agenda anymore.
Trump also warned on social media that the U.S. would hit Iran 20 times harder if it halted oil flows through the Strait of Hormuz, though he said he hopes that will not happen. With the conflict still ongoing, some countries are showing a willingness to mediate, including Russia, Iran's ally, as was disclosed by Trump, who said this was discussed in a phone call with his Russian counterpart. An Iranian deputy foreign minister also confirmed that several countries, including Russia, China, and France, have called for a ceasefire. With many countries signaling interest in mediation, attention is on whether diplomatic efforts could move the conflict toward negotiations. Park Kwon-woo, Arirang News.
Meanwhile, a pledge of action from finance ministers of the Group of Seven helped to push down soaring global oil prices and lift the U.S. stock market. Lee Seung-jae reports.
Global oil markets and U.S. stocks swung sharply on Monday as investors reacted to developments in the Iran war. Oil prices initially surged on rising tensions in the Middle East. Brent crude briefly climbed to nearly $120 per barrel after reports that Turkey intercepted a ballistic missile launched from Iran using a NATO air defense system in the eastern Mediterranean. It was the second time Turkey shot down an Iranian missile this month, raising concerns about possible escalation involving a NATO member. However, prices later reversed after the Group of Seven countries signaled a coordinated release of strategic oil reserves if supply disruptions worsen.
And we stand ready to take necessary measures such as stockpile release. G7 energy ministers will take this discussion forward already tomorrow.
You saw the French declaration that we are now also keeping open the option of drawing on national oil reserves. Now is not the right time, but we, including Germany, are open to doing so in a coordinated process at the appropriate time.
Following the announcement, Brent crude fell about 8% to around $84 per barrel, while U.S. benchmark West Texas Intermediate dropped by roughly 9% to about $81. The New York Stock Exchange saw similar volatility. Major indexes opened more than 1% lower, but rebounded after news of the possible G7 reserve release and comments from Trump suggesting the war was as good as over. During a phone interview with CBS News, Trump said the conflict was very complete, pretty much, claiming Iran's military capabilities have been largely destroyed, including its navy, communication systems, and air force. He added that Iran's remaining missiles are scattered and that its drones and drone manufacturing facilities are being destroyed across the country. 이승재, Arirang News.
South Korean stock markets are on a roller coaster amid the escalating Middle East conflict. Hopes for an early end to the war, signaled by U.S. President Donald Trump, encouraged investors to return to South Korea's benchmark KOSPI on Tuesday. Our correspondent Kim Do-yeon has the details.
South Korea's benchmark KOSPI closed at 5,532.59 on Tuesday, up 5.35% from the day before, showing heavy swings that even triggered a buy-side sidecar in early trading. This is significant as it followed a steep decline that triggered a circuit breaker just the day before. The gains came amid remarks from U.S. President Donald Trump hinting that the conflict between the United States and Iran was very complete. Since Operation Epic Fury began early this month, the benchmark KOSPI has shown extreme fluctuations, triggering both sell-side and buy-side sidecars nearly every trading day. After closing at 5,791.91 on March 3rd, the index plunged 12.06% the next day to 5,093.54. It then rebounded 9.63% on March 5th to 5,583.90. Of the 9 sidecars, 5 were sell-side halts triggered during steep market declines, while 4 were buy-side ones activated during rapid rebounds. The volatility continued with a 5.96% drop on Monday to 5,251.87 before surging on Tuesday. Experts say the severe stock volatility is closely tied to the $1 exchange rate as well, with the greenback also fluctuating sharply amid the geopolitical crisis.
The South Korean stock market is an inefficient market dominated by foreign investors who account for about 35% and act as major players. When they buy, stock prices rise, and when they pull out to realize profits, prices fall.
Meanwhile, the Korean won is also fluctuating as it recovered on Tuesday after the exchange rate touched 1,500 won against the dollar at one point during the recent turmoil. With the same reasoning behind the KOSPI's moves, the won closed at 1,469.3 won per dollar, down 26.2 won from the day before. Kim Do-yeon, Arirang News.
And President Yo-jong has called for stronger preparedness as the tensions in the Middle East continue. During Tuesday's cabinet meeting, he also raised the possibility of a supplementary budget to help ease the burden on the domestic economy. Our Blue House correspondent Song Yoo-jung reports.
As tensions in the Middle East enter their second week following the U.S. military strikes on Iran, President Lee Jae-myung told his cabinet that their role is more critical than ever.
과거 어느 때보다도 더 절박하게 또 충실하게 최선을 다하면 지금의 상황을 더 나은 상황으로 만들 수 있다.
Presiding over a cabinet meeting on Tuesday, Lee said stabilizing prices is the government's most urgent task as uncertainty grows in energy supplies, logistics, and financial markets. The government plans to introduce a temporary price ceiling on petroleum products within the week. President Lee instructed the finance minister to ensure the measure minimizes the burden on customers.
생산 원가가 올랐다. 그거 하면 그 시점에는 다시 또 최고 가격을 변경해야 되는데 기존에 이미 한 열흘 이상 이렇게 이미 올려받은 부분, 그 부분을 고려해서 실제 유가가 오르더라도 그때 바로 최고 가격을 올리지 말고.
Lee proposed imposing a price cap during last week's extraordinary cabinet meeting. He warned of possible price gouging by oil refiners, citing rising fuel prices, despite South Korea holding petroleum reserves equivalent to 7 months of supply. The Fair Trade Commission has launched an investigation into possible collusion among refiners. The president even mentioned preparing a supplementary budget to ease the burden on consumers if the Middle East situation drags on.
We could consider cutting fuel taxes on gasoline by another 10% or increasing direct support. A combination of such measures could help ease polarization while protecting people's livelihoods.
이번 어차피 조기에 추경을 해야 될 상황인 것 같으니까. 지금 재정 지원이나 소상공인 지원이나 뭐 한계 기업들 지원인 뭐 등등 할래도 좀 추가의 재정이.
South Korea currently maintains a 7% tax cut on gasoline, with the maximum reduction capped at 37%. These discussions come as the Blue House has designated this week as an all-out response week to address developments in the Middle East, with a focus on public safety and economic stability. 송유진, Arirang News.
President Yo-jong says an all-in approach has now become an obstacle that hinders growth, as they called for corporate co-prosperity. Speaking at a meeting with private firms at the Blue House on Tuesday, he said fostering an environment where large conglomerates cooperate with smaller firms was crucial for sustainable growth. He noted the case of Hanwha Ocean eliminating discrimination between its employees and subcontracted workers for equal performance-based bonuses, and said he hoped to see more of such cases in Korean society. Dozens of companies joined the meeting, including Hanwha Ocean, Samsung Electronics, and SK. In response to the ongoing tariff risks raised by the Trump administration, South Korea's National Assembly has pledged to move swiftly on finalizing the U.S. Investment Special Act that lays out the details for Seoul's U.S.-bound investment. And the National Assembly is poised to finalize the deal this week. And for more on the details, we have our political correspondent An Sung-jin with us today. Welcome back, Sung-jin.
Thanks for having me, Tommy.
So, Sung-jin, this special bill designed to implement strategic investment in the U.S. has been passed with bipartisan support. Tell us more about this bill specifically.
Right, Tommy. So just as you mentioned, just yesterday, the National Assembly advanced legislation aimed at managing and accelerating the large-scale investment in the United States. Now, it's notable that the Assembly Special Committee handling the bill unanimously passed a special act on strategic investment management between Korea and the U.S., often referred to as the U.S. Investment Special Act.
The investment bill has been passed through bipartisan agreement, with only the final approval remaining. A crisis can become an opportunity. The party and the Lee administration will move forward together to overcome the situation.
It is now time to prioritize people's livelihoods and the stabilization of the economy with these policies.
Now, what this law entails is that it is designed to implement a Korea-U.S. MOU, where Seoul plans to invest $350 billion in America. To oversee the effort, the legislation calls for the creation of the Korea-U.S. Strategic Investment Corporation, which will be fully funded by the government with 2 trillion won, or $1.36 billion in capital. The fund is set to support investments in projects including joint shipbuilding cooperation and other strategic initiatives. To mitigate potential financial and legal risks, the legislation mandates the creation of a risk management committee as well. Investment decisions, including project selection, funding amounts, and timing, will all be handled by a Korea-U.S. Strategic Investment Operations Committee within the corporation, which is to be chaired by the finance minister. Now, before the government begins negotiations with the U.S. on any proposed project, it will have to report to plan in advance to the relevant National Assembly committees for parliamentary oversight.
Now, Sung-jin, the process of reaching this so far hasn't been so smooth, I have to say. Why has the bill become so heated to begin with?
Right, so the proposed bill represents a compromise version that integrates 9 previously different proposed bills, reflecting input from both ruling and opposition parties, as well as the government. Its passage yesterday comes after weeks of political friction. Now, the special committee's work had stalled earlier amid opposition protests over the ruling party's unilateral push on other bills, such as judicial reform. Now, this legislation in particular gained urgency after U.S. President Donald Trump warned in January that tariffs on South Korean goods could revert to 25% if Seoul continued delaying the legislation needed to implement the bilateral investment agreement.
Then, now that the bill has advanced through this special committee, Sang-jin, what process do we expect to see next?
Right, good question, Tommy. So the legislation is expected to clear the National Assembly Legislation and Judiciary Committee and receive final approval at a plenary session on March 12th, which is this Thursday. If lawmakers follow through on the bipartisan agreement and pass the bill at this plenary session, the legislation will be formally enacted. Now, even before the law formally takes effect, the government has begun preliminary reviews of potential projects through an interim task force. Once enacted, the authorities plan to move quickly to finalize the investments and coordinate with their U.S. counterparts to maximize both tangible and intangible support from Washington. Now, the new law is expected to provide a backbone for one of the most largest overseas investment initiatives undertaken by South Korea. Attention is now turning to whether the law could help ease ongoing tariff risks and trade relations between the two countries, as Trump has repeatedly hinted at the possibility of higher tariffs amid delays in creating Seoul's investment framework.
Well, we'll have to see how the final approval at the plenary session unfolds this Thursday. Sang-jin, thanks for the coverage tonight.
My pleasure as always, Tommy.
A contentious labor law has taken effect today amid sharply divergent views between business groups and labor unions. Our political correspondent Moon Hae-ryun explains.
South Korea's controversial so-called Yellow Envelope Law took effect on Tuesday after a 6-month preparation period, bringing major changes to labor relations and collective bargaining. The revised labor law expands the definition of an employer and the scope of labor disputes, while limiting companies' ability to claim damages from workers involved in strikes. One of the most significant changes strengthens responsibility for subcontracted workers. Under the new rules, parent companies may be required to negotiate with subcontractor unions if they are found to exercise substantial control over those workers' conditions such as working hours and methods. Previously, negotiations were generally limited to unions representing workers directly employed by a company. The law also broadens the definition of labor disputes. In addition to decisions directly setting working conditions, disputes can now include management decisions that significantly affect them, such as restructuring or layoffs tied to overseas investment or factory expansion. The government says it spent the past 6 months preparing implementation guidelines and manuals to help companies and unions adjust to the new system. However, the law remains controversial. Business groups warn it could increase labor disputes, arguing that uncertainty over who qualifies as an employer may trigger conflicts at work sites. Labor groups, while welcoming the law, says it still falls short of fully guaranteeing bargaining rights. On the first day of implementation, several labor groups staged rallies and press conferences across Seoul, demanding direct negotiations with parent companies. Unions representing delivery workers, airport subcontractors, and university cleaners called on what they described as the real employers to come to the bargaining table. During a speech marking the 80th anniversary of the Federation of Korean Trade Unions, President Lee Jae-myung said he hopes the law will serve as a starting point for subcontracted workers and parent companies to resolve disputes through dialogue and compromise. The Labour Ministry expects some confusion in the early stages of implementation and says it will provide continued support. Moon Hae-ryun, Arirang News.
North Korea's Kim Yo-jong has slammed the annual ROK-U.S. defense drills currently underway, calling them a rehearsal for war that will hurt regional security. Our defense correspondent Kim Bo-kyung has this report.
Kim Yo-jong, the sister of North Korean leader Kim Jong-un and a department director of the ruling Workers' Party of Korea, warned on Tuesday about the joint military drills between South Korea and the U.S. In a statement carried by the Korean Central News Agency, she said hostile forces' military demonstrations near the regime's sovereign and security areas could lead to unimaginably terrible consequences. Calling the drills a provocative and aggressive war rehearsal, Kim said that regardless of any justification or adjustments, the exercise remains a large-scale, high-intensity war drill. Citing current global geopolitical crises and international conflicts, she added that such actions by enemy states should be met not with proportional responses, but with an overwhelmingly powerful and preemptive offensive. An expert said the remarks appear to be sending a message to the U.S. after its strikes on Iran.
It warns about the U.S.-South Korea joint military exercises, but indirectly it is also sending a message that, unlike Iran, North Korea would immediately retaliate with nuclear weapons if attacked.
Referring to what North Korean leader Kim Jong-un previously said, his sister again stressed the regime's law and iron principle that the strongest offensive capability is the most reliable deterrent. The expert added that while there could be provocations during the drills, they are unlikely to be serious.
It indirectly suggests that North Korea may stage a show of force if U.S. strategic assets are deployed to the Korean peninsula during the joint exercises. The provocation would most likely be launching a ballistic missile, with stronger provocation like an ICBM considered less likely.
South Korea and the U.S. began the annual springtime joint drills, Freedom Shield, starting Monday. The number of troops participating in the exercise is similar to last year, though the number of field training exercises has more than halved to 22 from 51 last year. Kim Bo-kyung, Arirang News.
Train services between North Korea and China will resume on Thursday this week after being suspended for some 6 years. And now, that's according to Kyodo News on Tuesday, based on remarks made by a Chinese official. According to the Japanese outlet, the passenger train service had been halted upon the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic. And even after the virus subsided, North Korea continued to refuse Chinese visitors, and only tourists from Russia were able to visit. However, at the North's Workers' Party Congress last month, the regime pointed to the tourism sector to boost economic growth. The outlet noted that China is North Korea's largest trading partner, and economic cooperation is likely to gain momentum. K-pop sensation BTS will expand its upcoming comeback concert schedule for March 21st by increasing the total audience capacity to around 22,000 people. According to the group's agency Big Hit Music on Tuesday, additional standing areas will be added near Gwanghwamun Square, where fans can watch the performance on large LED screens. Now, tickets can be booked from Thursday at 8 p.m. through the online platform Knoll Ticket. Ahead of the performance, BTS will release its fifth studio album, Arirang, and open a special pop-up store in Seoul featuring merchandise inspired by traditional Korean aesthetics. And the pop-up will run at Shinsegae Department Store's main branch and HYBE headquarters from March 20th until April. As a wellness culture becomes more and more popular, young Koreans are turning to traditional healing practices. Moxibustion and rice enzyme spas are emerging as a new experiential wellness spaces. Our Do Young-eun tells us more.
Opening the door, a slightly smoky herbal scent of mugwort fills the air. The shop specializes in traditional Korean moxibustion therapy, which uses heat and smoke of burning mugwort. Customers lie on treatment beds, relaxing as the heated mugwort is first placed beneath their feet. The therapy continues with fumigation treatment along the back before mechanical moxibustion devices are set on the stomach to deliver steady warmth.
My hands and feet tend to get cold, and I often feel tired. I heard mugwort moxibustion is good for your health, so I looked for a place near my home and decided to try it.
Nearby, a rice enzyme spa, once mainly enjoyed by older generations, now offers another popular wellness experience for younger visitors. Here, people bury themselves in warm fermented rice bran, leaving only their faces exposed. The heat generated from fermentation is believed to help detoxify the body, improve blood circulation, and strengthen the immunity system.
In the past, most visitors were older people. But these days, many younger customers are coming too, after seeing it on social media or YouTube.
Spaces like this are redefining traditional therapy as a modern healing experience to recharge both the body and mind. Experts say the trend reflects how the digitally native generation treat traditional wellness practices as shareable experiences.
Nowadays, when people see something on social media that's said to be good for their health, they want to try it themselves. Experience-based consumption has become a major trend.
The relatively affordable price of these activities has helped them emerge as a cost-effective wellness experience. As younger generations explore new ways to care for their health, traditional health practices are finding new life in Korea today. 조영은, Arirang News.
We'll need to wear a mask that protects against fine dust through tomorrow. Dust that flowed in from overseas yesterday, combined with locally generated pollution, has been lingering due to stagnant air. And ultra-fine dust levels stayed at bad levels across most parts today, could linger into tomorrow. Meanwhile, the Gyeongsangdo region is having very dry conditions. Dry weather advisories have been reissued for parts of the region, including Daegu and Busan. And as for temperatures now, mornings still feel winter-like with sub-zero temperatures. And even tomorrow, Seoul, Daegu, and Gwangju will begin the day at just 0 degrees Celsius. Then by the afternoon, Seoul will get up to 8 degrees. Daegu, Busan, Gwangju will make it to 13 degrees Celsius. Temperatures will go up higher as the week goes on with wide daily temperature swings. With that in mind, here's a look at the international weather conditions.
That's all we have for tonight. I'm Kim Dami. From all of us here at Arirang, thanks for watching and good night.
Are you curious about Korean cultural heritage?
If you are a fan of Korean culture and history, listen up. Korean cultural heritage is based on a 5,000-year history.
The whole country is like a massive museum because it possesses such diverse cultural properties. Let's not wait any longer and take a look.
First, for beginners. For those who are not familiar with Korea, let's start with the world-famous list.
You can see how Korea's beautiful traditional patterns and historical features have been preserved.
And don't forget to experience Korea's intangible cultural heritage. From Ganggangsulle to Talchum, there's just so many exciting cultural heritages to experience.
These are for intermediate level tourists who have already visited Korea and its famous attractions. You might even be standing in a World Heritage Site right now.
How about searching for intangible cultural heritage that you can experience? 한소리, 제주 해녀 diving, 김장. Make some unforgettable memories while having fun.
Last but not least, the advanced level. It's the memory of the World Register. Korea possesses an extensive documentary heritage. Korea is serious about documentation and preservation.
A tour of Korean cultural heritage will become a legacy of your own.
Why not make your own Korean cultural heritage travel itinerary?
Isn't it fascinating?
Knock knock! The magical door to the world of K-animation is swinging wide open. Meet your instant new BFF, the adorable Catch. Tina Ping will have you hooked from the very first glance. Need a hand? Our Robocar Pony Rescue team is always zooming in to save the day. How about tagging along on Ping Fong and Pal's super exciting quest to reclaim their lost magic? With the mysterious life forms Cabion by your side, you can become a Cabion master and save humanity like the total hero. Protecting children's innocence while igniting their boundless imaginations. That's the magic of Korean animation. K-animation, the ultimate bestie for kids worldwide.
Welcome to Within the Frame, where we bring the most pressing issues across the globe into focus. I'm Kim Mo-gen. Tensions in the Middle East are sending shockwaves through the global economy. Following U.S. and Israeli strikes on Iran, financial markets have reacted sharply, with the Korean won briefly weakening past the 1,500 mark against the dollar, its lowest level since the aftermath of the global financial crisis. And at the same time, international oil prices have surged amid fears of supply disruptions around the Strait of Hormuz, a critical route for global energy shipments. Policymakers are weighing emergency measures, including fuel tax cuts, strategic oil releases, and even potential price caps on petroleum products. As global uncertainty deepens, attention is also turning to Korea's trade strategy after the National Assembly passed a major investment law aimed at strengthening economic ties with the United States and easing tariff tensions. For a closer look into the economic situation, we connect to Shin Se-dun, professor of economics at Sookmyung Women's University. A big welcome, Professor.
Good evening.
And also joining us is Hwagin Kim, professor of banking and finance at Texas A&M University's Mays Business School. Good to see you, Professor.
Good to see you, and thank you.
So first, let's start off with Professor Kim, with the market reaction first. Following the U.S. and Israel's strikes on Iran, the $1 exchange rate briefly surged past 1,500 won, which I said is a level not seen in the aftermath of the global financial crisis. Professor Kim, what does this sharp movement in the currency market tell us about how investors are assessing the risk right now?
Right. So I think the last time the Korean won per dollar surpassing the 1,500 won was in 2008 global financial crisis. So including also 1997, I think the Asian crisis, this 1,500 won seemed to work as some form of psychological barrier to investors, both domestic and foreign investors. So the signal-wise, looks like the global investors are heading into more like a flight to safety mode. And when we saw the U.S. and Israel striking Iran, the immediate market reflex was to dump like all the risky assets, like including U.S. market itself, of course. And also the shifting from weaker currencies in favor of the safer haven currencies, including dollars and yens and Swiss franc and things like that. So clearly it has a lot to do with, in this case, energy supply And as we can see now that the G7 countries are talking about using oil reserves, and also the President Trump's remark that the end is not like the war is not like, that near the end, that kind of things actually push the energy price down, and also the stock market restored. So clearly a lot of volatility, meaning the investors are assessing, but at the same time, uncertainty is highly affecting the whole market. And also, I think to Korea, given this system of the export-driven economy, this type of things is going to be very big, because obviously, the oil is a raw material that is used for most of the productions, etc. So I think clearly it's going to have negative impact, and the investors are assessing this as one of the major risks. Having said that, I think if we compare this to 2008 cases, if you remembered, the exchange rate actually jumped from about like 951 to 1501 within a month. So I think the gap and also the speed was like really high. On the other hand, as of now, I think it was already around like 1400 to 1450. Even with the various intervention from the Bank of Korea and the government's, the messages. And then I think it moved by another 51 or something. So I think percentage-wise, and also in terms of speed, it's much weaker, I think, in terms of the effect. So I think we already have lots of other risks. So that's probably why the currency is relatively in weak position. And then I think this energy price and also the regional conflicts in the Middle East, I think affects additionally about like 20% or something. So clearly it's not a great situation, but it's not as bad as in 2008-9 situation, I believe.
It's a little bit better than back then, but still the level of risks are quite high. Now, beyond the exchange rate, there are also concerns about a broader financial market volatility as geopolitical tensions rise, of course. So from a financial stability perspective, Professor Shin, how concerned do you think we should be about turbulence in the currency and financial markets?
Well, if we talk about exchange rate, for the last 1 year, 12-month period, the volatility of Korean currency is almost like the volatility of Japanese yen. It moved in tandem for the last 1 year, 12 months. And if you look at 2-year period from 2024 until the end of 2025, it also moved almost 95% together. So to me, Korean currency, gyration for the last couple of days, it's just a short-term period. And if you look at it a little longer, Korean currency is not more vulnerable compared to Japanese yen. So I think Korean currency vulnerability is overblown in some sense. But the Korean stock price has been rising almost 100% for the last, I think, a year from initiation of the administration. So there is a vulnerability of Korean stock market, which has been, risen almost 100%. So everybody was talking about, KOSPI has been overblown. So we were waiting in some sense, when the KOSPI will drop precipitously. And at the time, there was an Iranian war. So I think for the last, 2 weeks, the KOSPI has been dropping more than 10%. And that, I think, is going to cause a significant, problem for the generation 2030 who has borrowed trillions of dollars, trillions of won into KOSPI market. So I think it is not Korean currency, which has been pretty stable compared to other currency. I think the stock market is pretty, vulnerable when, the war continues for a couple more weeks. So to me, I think the stock market is something that we have to be careful about.
So we could be more concerned about the volatility in the stock market right now. Then the financial sector is quite stepping in right now with this situation. Banks and financial groups have begun offering emergency financing and liquidity support for exporters and small businesses as well. Professor Kim, how important do you think is the role of financial sector in preventing market instability from spreading into the broader economy?
I think this proactive intervention is a pretty good move, and also it's a necessary move. If we learn from history, I think including the Great Depression and many of these, whether it's a financial crisis or like just a more real sector-led recessions, if the big turmoil, especially during the short-term type of the situation, it is important for financial sectors provide liquidity to firms, especially the smaller firms, because they're more obviously subject to any kind of cash crunch and the constraints related to financing part. The modern firm activities are very different compared to the old days, in that like every day all this kind of their operation activities are tied to the financial activities, because virtually all of these money transactions are happening through financial the institutions. Therefore, if some part of it is going to be hamstrung, then I think that's going to have a big issue, I think, in terms of daily operations. So meaning supply chain side is like completely tied and connected to the financial side. So given that, I think that stepping in with this type of emergency financing and the liquidity supports, I think banks are acting very wisely, and also as a good vital firewall. So I think definitely it can prevent possible contagion of like these sort of shocks of liquidity spiral down, so that multiple domino effects on the smaller firms leading to the bigger firms type of the things. So I think overall, I think it's a positive and good move.
So let's hope it could really cushion the shock. Now, turning to the real economy, Professor Shin, Korea imports roughly 70% of its crude oil from the Middle East, and concerns are growing about disruptions around the Strait of Hormuz. How vulnerable is the Korean economy to an energy supply shock from the region?
Well, that depends upon how long the war extends. And we have witnessed, the crude oil price rose over $100 couple of days, but now it dropped to to $80. And there are two problems. One is the availability of crude oil, and the other one is the price. And availability, that depends upon how long the war would last. But we have, I think, several month reserves. So as long as the war ends within a couple of months, I think the availability is not a serious problem. And real problem is the price, but fortunately the price went down from over $100 to $80. And if the war ends within a few weeks from now, I think even the price will die down. So much, I think the Korean reaction to the Iran war, I think it's overreaction. I mean, over anxious. I think we have to be calm down, and as long as the war ends, within a few weeks, I think everything will return to normal. So I'm not that much over anxious about the crisis happening around the Middle East.
Right. So really everything depends on how long the situation would last. But even though the oil prices have plunged down a little bit, some are still concerned about the impact on inflation and the economic growth in Korea. Professor Kim, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, so I think the situation itself has some concerning parts. I also agree with Professor Shin's argument that we don't have to overreact, but still, there's always 5%, 10% chance that war actually can be lingering and just longer, as we saw from the Russian and Ukrainian cases. So I think that's kind of probably the worry that people or investors are actually placing some weights on. So I mean, the issue I think is, of course, if it gets longer, as actually just mentioned, then in that case the producer price is going to increase, and also the cost of production definitely is going to increase. And now I think that Korea has finally sort of like almost escaped from somewhat like the stagnant growth mode, and also the stock market is now, I think, they're revving up and maybe a bit too fast, but I think at least I think it's good sign. So everything seems to be now in more normal phase, and now I think this kind of blow, if it's that lingers on, then I think it can actually really cool down this optimistic mode. So I think that's probably the concern. So I think the higher oil price typically act as some form of like a short-term tax on everything from manufacturing to logistics in case of Korea, because Korea obviously is importing almost all of these kind of things. So eventually these type of the cost can be passed down to consumers. And also I think this type of the price gouging, and also the guessing sort of like the acts of like buying up the oils and also trying to increase the price, that kind of like the speculative behavior always also kicks in. So I think the government seems to address that kind of thing. So let's see what happens. But the growth wise, there's some available studies about like I would look at some of the Korean researchers that definitely the oil price increase have somewhat longer term effects on the lower economic growth. So clearly, I think that's kind of the part that are all like priced now, and then also people are concerned about this. So I guess overall, I can understand the sentiment clearly. And also, I think it's somewhat supported by the existing studies that it clearly has negative impact on economic growth. I mean, it's a no secret.
And also, to address these kinds of concerns that are mounting, the government is right now, it's considering introducing a price cap on petroleum products. Professor Shin, how unusual or effective is this type of policy during this times of energy crisis?
Well, how unusual. We never had the price cap in any kind of product, since 2019, it's more than 25 years, I think. There has never been a price cap in Korea. So I think it's a very strange action on the part of the government. And it is just 1 week, almost 10 days. So I went to a gas station today, and the price was surprisingly the same about 10 days ago. So I think the media kind of, reaction to Iran war is a little overblown, because there are many gas stations in Korea. The price is almost the same as before a couple of weeks ago. So if, the war ends within, I think, 10 days, which is pretty possible considering the United States situation, I think we are too much overreacted to, something happened in Middle East, and it's going to have a significant effect upon real economy, because many people are so afraid about, what's happening in Iran. So I think we have to be a little calm down and see if, what's happening in the Middle East and what happens to the decision of the President Trump. So I think a little nervous, about the people's reaction.
Right, so we shouldn't really be too much overreacting, and look into what the developments are in the coming days. Now, when we shift a little bit to trade and investment policy, Korea's National Assembly has passed the U.S.-Korea Strategic Investment Special Act, which supports about $350 billion in investment to the U.S. Professor Kim, what does the scale of this overseas investment mean for Korea?
I mean, it's a humongous deal. So I think it's essentially Korea building a giant state-backed outward investment fund, similar to in spirit to, I think, a sovereign wealth or a strategic fund, but rather focusing completely on the U.S. real economy. And I think it's not, of course, just this Korea situation, but many other countries as well. But given the size of the country, I think, relatively speaking, this is a huge the investment fund that Korea has to put up with. So the plan, of course, is to deploy up to $20 billion a year over roughly a decade. So I think, and plus some other deals for the shipbuilding, $150 billion, if I remember correctly. Then, if executed well, I think clearly Korea is going to be swapping tariff relief and geopolitical stability for long-term equity stakes. And it's going to depend on, of course, how things will change, but in terms of the details. But I think at least, like with other risky investment, I think if it's done well, then it's basically like, to me, Korea is like a small scale, not small scale, but I think it's like some private equity fund for the U.S. equity stakes in some sense. Hopefully, I think Korea can actually get or enough like a recoup of these kind of things, although it's probably not that easy given this political, the situation all tangled up. But I think financially, I think it's going to have, in the short term, definitely have negative impacts toward the foreign exchange reserves. And I think that's somewhat priced already in our current exchange rate, actually. And over the longer term, it's going to entirely depend on the performance. I think it's a bit early to talk about it.
Mm-hmm. Now, we are aware that the investment, much of it is expected to focus on strategic sectors like shipbuilding and semiconductors. Professor Shin, how could this reshape Korea's industrial strategy and its economic partnership with the U.S., considering, it's a very big portion of the trade deal as well?
Well, Korean government had committed about $20 billion a year, and we have to remember that annually Korean current account surplus is more than $100 billion. So the $20 billion annual commitment to the investment project is not significant. Is it too significant? I think Korea could manage that amount, $20 billion a year, as long as we continue $100 billion current account surplus. So that's not the problem. Real problem is how fruitful America and Korean government engaged in profitable projects. We don't know what kind of projects the Korean government and the United States is thinking about. We know something about the Japanese commitment. So the real problem is not exchange rate. It's not the money, $20 billion a year for 10 years. It is the productivity and the industrial kind of effectiveness of the project. So I think considering the Trump administration's political popularity, especially after the midterm in November, I think everything could change if the Trump could not succeed in winning the congressional election in November. So everything is very shaky at the moment, until the November midterm election. That's my perception.
Mm-hmm. So a lot of things that are still undecided. We'll have to see how it will go, be it politics or economy or the situation in the Middle East as well. So as for now, we will have to conclude our discussion right here. Thank you so much for your insights tonight, Professor Shin.
Thank you.
And Professor Kim, we also really appreciate it.
Thank you.
And that'll be all from us on Within the Frame. Be sure to tune in again next time as we continue to explore the stories that matter. Until then, stay informed and engaged.